All right. I forget that now that I added an AI transcriptor to the thing, it doesn't say recording in progress on my end anymore. It just starts. So,
Yeah.
uh, anyway, so welcome to an episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today we are going back over to Western Pennsylvania. We haven't been there for a little bit, but we spent a few episodes there in 23 and early 24 talking to some people who will come up on this podcast. But today we're focusing on one Matt Strickland. He's currently of Iron City Distilling, although he has other uh, let's say titles, credits as well that we'll get into. He is based around Pittsburgh now, as is Iron City up in Creighton, and just thrilled to have him on. So, Matt, welcome on.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's very kind of you.
So, Matt, you're someone I've wanted to have on for a while, mainly because I found you through your writing
Hmm.
rather than through necessarily your distilling history,
Hmm.
which we'll get into as well. So, but I want to start with the latter. So, your background's educationally, it's originally in viticulture, MS from Oregon State University,
Hmm.
though that was after a BS in vertebrate biology.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just curious
Yeah.
how that broke off there.
It was kind of neat. I was, I grew up in Middle Tennessee, about an hour south of Nashville, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do with myself after high school. I went to a very prestigious, college prep school, and I was um, definitely. I did not fit in that well. I'll say that. It's all good, but I was the one person that did not go to the senior class party and everything after graduation. Um, but no, I did not know what I wanted to do. So I started in college with like a philosophy major, but I kind of dropped out and then just sort of bummed around for a few years and eventually I decided that it was time for me to go back. I think it was 22, 23 at the time, maybe 24. And I had become really interested in zoology, particularly fish. And so I was studying fish science and under a professor there. And he was quite a bit of a mentor for me, and he uh, let me work in his lab and help out with his graduate assistants, and that kind of helped build my resume for what I thought I was going to end up doing. And all of this eventually got to a point where he sat me down, and I guess I was working a full-time job at the time too, and I was kind of paying my way through school, and he sat me down. He was like, this is not really what you want to do. You're always coming in here talking about brewing beer and all the beers and stuff that you like to, and this was in like the mid 2000s, something like that, late, yeah, maybe like 2009, something. Anyway, so he was like, no, that's what you should be doing. You should be studying brewing. You should be going to work for a brewery. So immediately the next day, I started applying to grad school for brewing sciences, basically fermentation science. And there still aren't, but even at that time, there really just weren't that many universities offering anything. And I got really lucky. I wound up at Oregon State in their wine program, which is I didn't know it at the time, but what considered one of the best wine programs in the world. And um, I was given a full ride, and I got to work on some really cool and that really kind of drove me into the wine world quite a bit. It was a blast, and I'm actually just in the past year kind of rediscovering my love of wine. But uh, yeah, so I was doing research for the wine industry there, but the wine industry is it's seasonal. I mean, and even with a master's degree from a place like Oregon State, it's very difficult to get a full-time job. Typically, the way the wine industry works is you apply for some kind of harvest position, internship sort of thing. They will work you insane hours, 80 to 100 hours a week sometimes. Um, all manual labor, and you'll be doing this, you know, you're making lots of money because you don't have time to spend it. Usually they pay for your housing and your food. But then after 4 or 5 months, at best, you're laid off. So what do you do with the rest of your time? Well, if you're single, and you don't have anything tying you to an area, you could go to South America or Australia. You could go to the Southern Hemisphere a few months later, and repeat the whole process. And that's what a lot of people I knew did. It just I had a wife and we were talking about starting a family. It just wasn't really in the cards. Um, so, long story short, I ended up getting offered a job running research and development for a distillery in my hometown in Nashville. I didn't know the first thing about distilling, and they said, "That's okay. We'll teach you, but we need somebody to kind of help out with all the projects we're working on." With my lab background and everything, I think, the thinking is, oh yeah, well, he could probably handle that. So that was how my distilling career started.
And I'm going to put a pin in that just for a second because I want to talk about Corsair as well. Uh,
Mm.
um, I did hear, and this interview I'm going to be referencing a bit through this interview. But if anyone is listening and really wants to get even more of the discussion, I highly recommend listening to or watching let's try that again. Society of Spirit Symposium back in June 2024, where you spoke with Reed Huddleston.
Yes, I did do that. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
No, I've
so
known Reed for a few years. Yeah.
which is a great conversation. Like I said, well, I have some questions off of it, but
Mhm.
sometimes it's great to go back to the source too. So highly recommend it. During that interview, this was just a couple, half a year ago or so, you said you were going to start working on your PhD
Yep.
potentially,
Yep.
and
I'm currently doing that.
that was with
Yeah.
Annie Hill and Don Masklin.
Yeah, Dawn Maskell.
Maskell.
Yeah, yeah, Dawn Maskell. Dawn is my official advisor, and then Annie is sort of like a secondary advisor. I mostly work with Dawn. Um, and yeah, so they are both based in Edinburgh, Scotland,
Mm.
with Harriet Watt University. So yeah, I'm working on a project with them that we think is hopefully pretty exciting. So certainly something that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody, at least at the university level, has tried to tackle. So we're kind of chuffed about the whole thing.
Fantastic. Well, like I said, that we're gonna jump back to that in the second half of our interview because I really do want to know more about that. Like I said, I got questions out of that interview as well.
Sure.
Want to start off, yeah, with your history, your process. So jumping back to Corsair, um, whether it was when they were in Kentucky or when you were with them when they were in Nashville, they are in Nashville. Uh, they are what I would consider definitely one of the most iconoclastic distilleries that we've had in
Yeah,
the U.S. Um,
sure.
and you can, I mean that in a positive way, and you can really see it as kind of a see what sticks ideation. Like they're willing to try anything, and so a research and development position sounds quite exciting, even for someone who didn't have a distillation background.
It was a lot of fun. It really was, and I learned a lot from the people there. Andrew Weber, who was one of the co-founders of the company. I don't think he's there anymore. Andrea Clodfelter, who was the head distiller at the time, and Derek Bell, who's still the owner of the company, and then everybody else I worked with too. I mean, they were really, really welcoming, and they taught me a lot over the few years I was there. I was there for about little over 3 years. Um, and it was kind of interesting to come into that environment, not really knowing what to expect. And keep in mind at the time, like I didn't really know that much about spirits at all. I was just trying to be in the alcohol industry and just trying to figure out where I fit in. And I honestly thought I would wind up in brewing. And it just, my experience with working in breweries, I kind of realized that it just it really wasn't for me. It was, you know, it was very well, you spend 80% of your time cleaning. I mean,
Right.
and we do a lot of that in distilleries, but we don't have to, we don't have to stress about it quite as much. And so,
Right.
you know, my brewery counterparts with Pittsburgh Brewing Company always come over. They see me doing something with a fermenter. They're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm cleaning." And they're like, "We didn't know you knew how to do that." Um, you know, um, I'm like, yeah, but no, I got to work on a lot of really cool stuff, and there was this attitude of like, well, let's just try it and see what happens, um, and uh, and it was this really like organic kind of punk rock attitude too, which I really identified with, and it was so much fun. I think the first year there, I had like 80 different whiskey prototypes under my belt. And um, now a lot of those were, variants of kind of the same concept, but, we played with, hopped whiskeys and different types of smokes in whiskey. And I mean, it was just, and all these different grains,
Mhm.
to this day, I'm fairly convinced I'm still the only distiller in the world that's made a whiskey from teff. And, I mean, it's just, I mean, maybe that's not true, but
I mean, I'm not, I
I'm
haven't
not
heard
that
one, so
clever.
I'm not gonna disagree with you on
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm not that clever, so who knows? But no, I mean, we had a lot of fun. And it was through them that I got introduced to the guys at Moonshine University slash the Distilled Spirits Epicenter, and that was um sort of what started my consulting and teaching work. And in a weird way, kind of started the writing as well too. So
At somewhere like I said, at Corsair, you're exposed to so many different things, and uh, it's let's just say, as your first exposure, like real full time gig exposure to the distilling industry, and have you what parts of that ideology have stayed with you through your career, and what have you kind of left behind?
I mean, I don't know if you ever really leave any of it behind. I think that at the time, um, I came in with a master's degree and I thought I was, a big deal. And, it's like, like everybody in there, you kind of quickly, get knocked upside the head a few times and you realize like, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing, and I wish I'd probably figured that out much sooner, but, no, I definitely carry a lot of those experiences with me. The willingness to just try something, and honestly, I think it's not that I've left any of it behind. It's just, my personal views on how I approach whiskey development, innovation strategies, how the industry should behave, how where my place is in it, and blah blah blah. This has all been kind of informed. My daughter's chasing after our dog.
Okay.
But anyway, so I really, like I think some of the things that I think back on, I'm like, was that really that innovative at the time? And maybe it was at the time, but through, you know, just because you could do it doesn't mean you should do it. Like I remember, my boss had me do a whiskey that was where the grain had been smoked with catnip, and it was just like, why am I doing, and people think I'm kidding when I say this, but we had a distillery cat who was very famous at the time. She was more famous than the distillery, I think, in some regards, but she loved that whiskey.
I bet.
So, but no, I really took a lot with it, and there was this sort of very freeing ethos about just how they approached just even running a company where, I did a short stint working for a brewery in Southern California, and I worked there for a few months and quickly realized that I just did not jive with the company. I was working 14 hours a day for very little money. You know, very hardly even a thank you from my boss ever, and it was just a very cliquey, like very corporate culture and all this stuff, and it just felt it just didn't fit, and and it was a great fit for some people. You know, there were a lot of people that left around the same time I did for similar reasons, but which is why I'm not naming the company. But you know, th- um, they did have this they had this culture, and and compare that to what I experienced at Corsair, and it was very like, hey, we're all friends and we're all in this together, and that has really informed my approach in some regards, like how I handle my employees today. You know, um, I definitely there were things that I didn't like, but there were also a lot of things that I had a lot of respect for. And so, but one of the most important things I've learned over the years is building a company culture that, your culture is one of your most valuable tools. And, uh, I have probably, and I know everybody says this, but, really, I have some of the best guys in the business working for me. So, you know.
Uh, it's notable, and one of the reasons I ask about it is because your career, a little over a decade now in the distilling industry, maybe closer to a decade and a half. I don't want to shortchange you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
Uh,
no, it's fine.
uh, it's been. I think I looked at it two ways at two different points in the day when I was writing the questions. The first way I looked at it was that it was a little itinerant. When I say,
Yeah.
Corsair, this is not necessarily in order. Corsair District Distilling in DC, Distillerie Cotes de
Hmm.
Saints in Quebec, and then now Iron City Distilling, plus the teaching and writing along the way. So on one hand, it's itinerant. On the other hand, the I feel like the generation of distillers that you're part of, who have come up in, let's say, even as early as the mid to late 90s through the 2000s and early 2010s, tend to be more itinerant. They'll
Yeah.
go to a
Yeah.
place 3 to 5 years maybe, and it's just not. It's very different from the generations prior of the family heritage distilleries and all that, where you're at Beam for 25 years or you're at Heaven Hill for 40 or something. It's just
Yeah.
different. So just that's really to say, when I say itinerant, I don't mean it in any negative connotation. I really just mean it's kind of factual. If anything
No,
else,
none
uh,
taken. No.
yeah,
I mean, I have my own views on it. I was a bit of a hired gun for a few years. Um, Part of that was my doing, you know, and part of it was just kind of the way the industry has sort of shaped itself. The industry really in the United States, and I guess now you can say worldwide, particularly with regards to whiskey, has exploded at such an amazing clip that there's more distilleries opening than there are distillers to run them. And what you see happening, because as itinerant as I have been, I've got, friends of mine in the industry that are far more itinerant. And I won't name names, but you could probably think of a few. And um,
I'm friends with
you
a few
know,
as well. So yeah,
yeah, and the thing is that some of that is just following where the money goes. Some of that is keeping yourself interested and working on exciting new projects. And some of us just really love building distilleries. Now, I mean, I've sort of, I say this on every project, but I really mean it this time. I told my wife, I was like, I cannot build another distillery unless it's my own. Like, I'm not doing this ever again. Um, it's too exhausting. When I was getting district distilling built out, I remember I worked 7 days a week, 3 months straight. I took one day off and then did it all over again. And I was the only employee there. And it was just, my wife, she calls herself a work widow every single time I start a new place. And I've gotten better about it. I've gotten better about asking for help, and but it is. it is one of those things you get into the thick of it and you get really obsessive about what you are going to do, how you're going to do it. And I have a very holistic approach to these things. So it's not just, oh, I have a recipe. How am I going to tweak that recipe? It's well, how is this whiskey going to fit into the current industry landscape? How is the branding going to work? And how are we going to market this thing? And what's the route to market strategy? And I'm trying to pit all these pieces because if they're not in alignment, your chances of success are greatly diminished.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this too, in that you, as you say, you're one of your priorities is to build a company culture that is one that you want.
Hmm.
Uh, and when you build out a distillery, you get to do that. You get to choose your staff to a certain extent, or to a great extent,
Hmm.
depending on where you are. You get to
Yeah.
choose who runs it, who, everything that goes into it. Um, and the trying to think of the question I want to ask here. So I can think the first thing that comes to mind is your career as a whole can kind of be, it almost looks like a compressed career in a way of other people, like I said, previous generations who would have done
Sure.
maybe 5 to 10 years at average place, but just compressed down on a time scale level. So um, you're thrown right into it at Corsair, which is like, you're getting really thrown into the lion's den of just
Yeah.
creativity and ideation. Then you've got, like you said, district distilling, you're building it out. Distillerie Cotes de Saints was somewhat built out as you were coming on, but you in 2018, but you did a bunch
Yes
of it
and
afterwards too.
no. They kind of had an idea of what they wanted to do.
Mm.
And these things, these business plans and investor decks that they give you and things like that. And they kind of will wine and dine you a little bit and tell you about, what their aspirations are and the distilleries they want to emulate. I mean, I treat these all like living documents. I mean,
Sure.
they're going to change. Even my own ideas, about what I think should be done. I mean, these things evolve over time. But yeah, I mean, we got there, and I still don't think we started production for probably close to 6 months. That's pretty normal, though. That's one of my least favorite things about it is sitting around waiting. Yeah.
I can understand that. I think the reason I'm asking about that is because because you've also been doing teaching and writing. You're seeing people at places like who are coming out of OSU, UC Davis, Michigan State, Harriet Watt, IBD, Moonshine University, all of these places, whether it's degree programs, certificates, or a week-long crash course,
Hmm.
um, that are interested in distilling, who want to start a distillery, work at a distillery, and having experienced this path of being thrown into, like I said, this den of ideation, and then very quickly after building out distilleries,
Yeah.
not that long into your career too. Um, do you do you see that kind of accelerated timeline as the new norm for people entering the industry?
I think so, and I think I think in a way it can be unfortunate. I probably flew the nest way too soon. Um, Not to say that, what we made at District Distilling that I'm not proud of it. I mean, we bought a bunch of the barrels and we're selling them at Iron City and we've been quite, I mean, they've won awards and blah blah blah. I mean, we've been quite happy with it. But, you know, I didn't really know at the time what it took to run a distillery, like really run one and really manage it and to really scale it up and to build a brand. I didn't really understand these things. And these things that, I'm still learning them. And I think that's, when you're that young in your career, like I was saying earlier, a lot of people, myself most certainly included, you kind of think you know a lot more than you do. And the longer you're in the the longer you're in the career, if you're paying attention, the more you realize you don't know. And um, so yeah, when I left there, I had similar realizations. I got to Canada and I realized, oh wow, there's a lot I still don't know. And then when I left Canada, I've spent the past few years getting Iron City up, and I've really just kind of settled into this. You know what? I'm just a perpetual idiot, and so but that's healthy for me, I guess.
If it's
So
something that feeds you well and you enjoy it, like that's fine. I I'm looking. I obviously one of the people who is always thought of as the itinerant distiller. I think he had that title, was like Dave Pickerel,
yeah,
and
yeah,
he's that just seemed. I never got to meet him, unfortunately. He passed before I could meet him, but
yeah,
he seemed to be just someone who just liked to bail out distilleries and help them figure out what grains to use and what barrels and all of that. And that
yeah.
was just his thing.
That was his thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody asked me, because I was in a marketing meeting the other day. We were hiring at a local PR company to, start rolling out some stuff for us. And I ended up doing most of the talking, and one of them asked me, like, what really excites you about your job when you come in? And I've said this to a lot of people over the years, but really I like puzzles, is what it is. I just like puzzles. I like coming in, and I told one of my guys this not this long ago. I was like, the worst days I have here are when everything goes fine. It's when everything's going to hell that I have the best time, because that's when I get to sweep into action. I train my guys, and if and I'd like to think I've trained them pretty well, because we don't really have that many problems. So they kind of come in, they do what they're supposed to do. At the end of the day, everything's all good. We've got whiskey we're happy with, and laying down barrels and blah blah blah. But I really love coming in and trying to figure things out. And so, when my boss was like, "Hey, would you think about doing partnering with this local bar and maybe doing some bitters for them?" I was like, "Oh yeah, I'll do that. I'll like let's jump on it." Because I love figuring things out. So um, that's the part of it that really gets me. And some people those rough days, and understandably so, they drive them crazy. But I really thrive in that. So yeah,
Hey, no, I honestly, I'm going to be honest with myself. I'm usually that type too. Like I like the crisis that just
yeah,
crystallizes things for me, and I can work really well. I'm a grant writer by day, so I like if it's closer to the deadline, that I work so much better if it's closer to the deadline. If it's too
yeah,
early, I can't get going. It just doesn't work. So
yeah.
I understand that, certainly in a different industry, but I understand that drive.
Oh no, it's the same idea though. It
Yeah.
really is.
So going along with the you know figuring out a puzzle and all this. So you've gone from Middle Tennessee to Oregon to
Hmm.
back to Tennessee, Nashville, to DC, to Quebec, and now to back to the States into about half hour northeast of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, yeah.
So
And my clientele takes
yeah,
me even farther abroad than that too. Yeah.
right, and that's the thing.
Um,
We haven't even mentioned your clientele work and your consulting work, and honestly, it's just not a question that I had kind of envisioned coming up. But you do have a significant client portfolio as well.
mm.
Just to throw that out there, if someone's listening to this podcast, which they might be, and are interested in your services, you want to do a quick plug?
Mostly what I'm doing these days is I'm working with Thoroughbred Spirits Group, and so that's really the organization to reach out to. But you can find me on LinkedIn. That's usually the best way to find me. I work on I'm very lucky. I'm very, very fortunate to be in a position where I actually have more clients than well, I have my pick of clients, let's say that. And so I really get excited about projects that you know I get to work in slightly different areas. Like I was in Argentina back in August. Yeah, right before the American Distilling Institute conference. Yeah, I was in Argentina for a week getting a client set up, and they're now the largest single malt maker in Argentina. Argentine single malt. I mean, who would think, right? Um, you know, I got asked to go down to Belize about a month before that to train some guys in rum production. Um, Belizean rum, it's not something we think about here, but man, it's phenomenal. So
I do,
I
but
mean,
that's because I've had the folks from Eric Kay on from Holmes Key and all
yeah,
that. So
yeah.
I like the Belizean rum, but yeah, for most of the whiskey audience, not so much.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. I've been really lucky to work in if you name a spirit category, I've probably worked in it. At least on a research and development level, if nothing else. But except for cream liqueurs and RTDs. Well, even RTDs I've dabbled in, but yeah, cream liqueurs I don't. You could ask. I have no idea how to build one. No, don't ask me to recreate Bailey's for you. I wouldn't know how to do it. So.
Fair enough. I may offline ask you for intro to that Argentine single malt because I've I've now interviewed people from five of the seven continents.
Oh yeah.
Antarctica is still getting worked up on something down there, but it's not nearly ready to talk about it. But South America is a nut that I have not been able to crack, especially
Yeah.
whiskey wise. I take that back. No, whiskey wise, yes, but I did speak to someone in South America from Patagonia. So,
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, I'm still. No, that makes 6 out of 7. Damn. Okay, so I'm doing better than I thought. Never mind. But still, I would love to talk to someone about
These
whiskey
guys, I mean,
in South
these guys
America
are
as well.
very cool. These guys are interesting. I'm very excited for them. I mean, the distillery is not massive, but it was a really neat experience because they invited me down, had me for a week, and I'd been kind of working with them remotely for a couple years as they got their equipment in and things like that. But they had me down to sort of help them dial in a few things. And they actually invited one or two other single malt makers um, from Argentina to come hang out for a few days uh, with us. And that was so awesome because I didn't know they were going to do that. And actually, one of the guys that came and hung out was the oldest single malt maker. He makes like maybe 3 barrels a week or something like that. It's a really small amount. But he brought me a bottle of his latest project. It was phenomenal whiskey. I've got it. Well, we've gone through about half of it. We have like we kind of joke at Iron City, my guys. We have like the best bar in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. But the only rule is that if it's unopened, they're not allowed to. Like I have to be the one to open it. Like they can't. But if I bring a bottle in and I open it, I'll come in and be like, oh, that's gone now. So they've been very careful with that one though. They know that one's special. But yeah, no, that was a really neat experience though. Getting to see single malt in an area that you would just not think it would be there. And it is, and it can be made really well. So,
It's the global South in general seems to be kind of tossed to the side, especially South America. Honestly, like
yeah,
India, obviously, there's a lot of attention there. The industry is booming. Australia, Oceania, yeah, we've got significant interest and there for sure.
sure.
I'll be talking to someone in Tasmania in a couple of days. So, and I've had a couple
Hmm.
from Australia and New Zealand on. But yeah, South America in particular, and Africa as well, outside of South Africa, it's just
You don't
not,
really, yeah, it
yeah, not
hasn't
represented.
evolved yet.
Yeah,
Um, and I'm really excited. That's one of those projects that gets me really excited is that, I get to play however small a role in the development of something completely new. And that, just seeing a look on those guys' faces and, they're tasting the spirit. I mean, it was just really great experience. So,
yeah. Honestly, for me as a host, like I'm, that's what gets me excited too, is talking to people from new places that I haven't visited, and that can be a new state. Like late in
yeah.
2024, we were talking to a few distilleries that were in the Carolinas. I
Hmm.
had never spoken to distilleries in the Carolinas before.
Yeah.
Same thing with Kansas City, Georgia. These are, and now I'm talking to someone in South Dakota. These are states that are not typically associated with distilling, not
Yeah.
even in the top 10 associated with distilling, and yet they need more attention. And then when you go worldwide, like I said, there are these. I love talking to the small distillery in New Zealand or on the Gold Coast of Australia who's like, I don't know if we're going to have distribution in the US for the next 10, 15 years, if then. So, I'm talking to them and knowing that my listeners, at least in the US, are probably never going to be able to taste it, unfortunately, but the stories are still so interesting. And you
And
get the
that's the
processes.
point.
Right.
It's the story,
Yeah.
and it's the unique viewpoint that you get.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you
I
can't
love
buy
that.
that.
I love it.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit more, of course, about Iron City and Pittsburgh, and this takes nothing away from it to say that we've I've spoken with Laura Fields and Bob McDonald
Hmm.
on episodes, spoke with Jim Hall of Liberty Pole Spirits on
Yep.
there as well, and I know there's somebody I'm forgetting too that has also been from around the area, plus just about Prohibition, the whiskey
Hmm.
rebellion. So there's some time spent there. There's time spent on Rose and Rye and Danko Rye as well, and these other varietals. So it's not to say that there's anything like we can. There's still a lot to talk about of the area. It's just when you go to
Yes.
somewhere that's brand new, tabula rasa, the questions become different because
Yeah.
you really have to get a sense of what is it like there? What's the terroir? What's the culture, the climate that all of this is being created in? And to me, that's some of the most exciting interviews that I've ever done is places that I have no idea that I didn't know made whiskey or spirits,
Yeah.
and suddenly, poof, there they are. Or gin. I keep thinking of the gin from Cape Byron that has, I think it's 23 botanicals in it, and most of them are local, and one of them almost killed Jim McEwen when he was down there. Like because he bit the wrong berry basically, and
Yeah.
it's Australia. Like if you don't know what it is, it
Yeah.
can probably kill you. So
Yeah.
like I love that kind of stuff. So that takes nothing away, but I definitely might lean on you if you like how this interview goes. I'll lean on you for an introduction or two.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. No, no. I mean, that's the nice thing about where we're at in Western Pennsylvania. Um, with very rare exceptions, honestly, like all the distillers here are absolutely wonderful folks. We're good friends with the guys from Liberty Pool. We're good friends with the guys from Wiggle, and
oh,
you know,
Wiggles on as
and
well.
it's
That's who I was forgetting. Thank you.
yeah. I mean, we try to be really friendly with everybody. We are kind of for whiskey in the state. We are sort of the one-ton gorilla in the room because we have capacity way far above what everybody else has. And we're still tiny, compared to, the big names and or even some of the medium names. I remember talking with Dwayne, the head distiller at the time. I don't know if he's still, I think he is. Anyway, a Bullet when the new Bullet distillery. And I was like, how big are you guys? He was like, oh, we're kind of medium distillery. We do about 800 barrels a day. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean,
You
well,
know.
when you said the guy from not Australia, Argentina is doing 3 barrels a day, he's like, it's 3 barrels a day or something. That's still 1,000 barrels a year. I mean, there are places I've had
No,
on who
he's more
do
like 3 barrels a week.
3 barrels.
Um,
So, but even
yeah.
so, there's a couple I've done who barely do a barrel a week. It's
Yeah.
very small production. Again, those can
Yeah.
be some of the most exciting stories.
They really can be. We're sized if we wanted to, we could do probably about 6 to 7,000 barrels a year. But yeah, I mean, 800 barrels a day for a so-called medium distillery, that's nothing. Um, But that's okay though. I mean, I'm perfectly fine with it. So
So 6 to 7,000 barrels, and just back of the head math, that's about 20 barrels a day ish.
yeah, if we wanted to, yeah, we could do probably about 20 barrels a day, give or take.
Yeah,
Yeah.
at maximum capacity,
Right now
like
we're
you said.
doing about 50. Yeah, right now we're doing about 50 barrels a week. Um, but yeah, we could do probably about 20 barrels a day if we really pushed it.
That's still pretty significant. I mean, like
Yeah,
like
it's
we
not it's not tiny, but
yeah,
it's
look,
you know.
we've had Jack Daniels and Beam and the bigs on here too, but sometimes and Heaven Hill, and where the best description that I always love is, they lose more whiskey on the floor than some folks making it
Yep.
here. Um,
Yep.
so I totally get that, but so focusing more on Iron City.
Uh-huh.
Um, so you said you spent the last few years building up Iron City, building out Iron City. At at what point in the distillery's creation did you come on?
So, very early. Um, so I was working in Canada and I got a phone call one day from a friend of mine who ran a consultancy based out of Canada and named First Key Consulting. They're very well known in the beer industry.
Mhm.
They work for a lot of major players and they were helping to build out a an old heritage brewery that they were basically trying to resurrect. And she calls me up and she says, "Hey, would you be interested in building a rye whiskey distillery in Pittsburgh?" And I said, "Yeah, probably. That could be cool." So I was hired on as the consultant for the distillery side of things. Basically, what had happened was our core brands, Pittsburgh Brewing Company, which is the home of IC Light and Iron City Beer. Iron City Beer is one of the oldest beer brands in the United States. Now, there are obviously older ones. Yingling is the oldest brewery, continuously operated brewery in the U.S. And there's a few other ones as well. But we're up there. I mean, Pittsburgh Brewing Company, Iron City Brewery was started in 1861 and has been in continuous operation since then. Now, even during Prohibition, I think they had switched to near beer or something like that, but they found a way to keep going. And but during the 90s, late 80s, 90s, the company started getting sold and the brands were starting to fall on hard times. You had owners come in that sort of thought that the beer business was just one giant party and they didn't really take it too seriously. They didn't invest in anything. They didn't really understand so things were starting to look pretty bad. And eventually the company fell into the hands of a private equity firm, and that's never a good sign. Private equity, no offense to anybody listening to this if you're in private equity, but just in the alcohol world, they just tend to just gut things. And so they removed production away from the original brewery and had it contract brewed out in Latrobe. And Latrobe did an okay job, but the quality control just really wasn't there. Nobody was really, private equity firm wasn't really marketing things all that well, yada yada yada. Well, they decided they're going to sell the brands back in 2016, 2017. Our owner, a gentleman by the name of Cliff Forrest, gets an email one day. He uh, sort of the American dream. He's sort of made his he worked his way up. He didn't come from money. He made his fortune, and he's in this position where he's sort of a serial entrepreneur, and he's one of those guys that gets those emails. It's like, hey, you want to buy a company? Yeah, it's like so. Like I get emails on Amazon about socks, I mean, it's just that's kind of the world he's in.
We're, I'm in the
So
echelon with you. I'm not. I'm. Yeah, we're not.
yeah,
We're in the same one there.
yeah. So he buys the company and he's really kind of an interesting guy to work for because he knew when he bought the company, he's like, I don't know anything about the beer business. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hire people that know about the beer business. And he just trusts them to do what is in his best interest. And that was effectively what happened with the distillery too. And um so eventually, they're rebuilding the brewery, they're rebuilding, and they realize they have space for a distillery. He's interested in whiskey as well as beer. He says, "Why don't we put in a distillery as well?" So that's how I landed the consulting gig. Um, well, like I was saying earlier in the call, there's more distilleries opening up. That's starting to change now, but there's more distilleries opening up than there is talent to go around. And I use the word talent for me very loosely, but um, they needed somebody to run the place and they couldn't find anybody. They had interviewed a few guys, but none of them really had a lot of experience. And so they called me one day and they said, "Hey, do you know anybody?" And at the time, my wife and I were thinking it might be time to move the family back stateside. And And it was like the numbers all lined up. It was a very generous offer. It was very generous actually, and we just really couldn't turn it down. So all of a sudden, I found myself running the place, and I come in, and I remember asking the president of the brewery, who was my direct report at the time. Now we have a president of the distillery that I report to, but he's relatively new. But at the time, I remember going into to Todd's office, and I said, "Well, what do you guys want to do?" You know, I I mean, I knew through the consulting process, all you guys kept saying was, we'll do rye whiskey, but you never got any more specific. I said, now that I'm here and you've hired me to run things, like I need to know what the plan is. And he was like, I don't know. We were hoping you'd figure it out. And I said, okay. Well, do you guys have like a brand in mind? Do you have a story or anything? He was like, no, we were hoping you'd figure that out too. So all of a sudden I had this unbelievably long leash to kind of do whatever I wanted, which for a guy like me is sort of the dream, right?
Mhm.
Of course, it sounds nice on paper, but a leash can really quickly become a noose if you don't know what you're doing. Um, so I immediately, the distillery was not done being built. Still a lot of construction to be done. Um, though when our owner wants something done, he has the resources to make it happen rather quickly. It was still going to be a few months away though. So we were putting everything. This was the second half of 22, and I started August 1st of 2022. And so I immediately started researching what was going on in Western PA, who was our competitive set. And I don't really think of them as competitors. It's just an ugly term. But anyway, that's, when you're doing marketing, I guess you got to think like that. So, who was our competitive set locally? Who was our competitive set nationally? How are we going to insert ourselves into the conversation? And most importantly, what would be defined as success to our owner? And that became actually kind of the trickiest thing. Like I said, our owner is a self-made man. So he is the quintessential American dream, rags to riches kind of story, right? Well, maybe not rags, but like I said, he didn't come from money. He started out as a salesperson and then ended up buying the company he worked for. And then he just started buying companies. And so he's really worked his way up. Well, he's kind of one of those guys that, what do you get somebody that already has everything?
Sure.
Right? So that's really tricky. And so I started and we had a bunch of meetings, and I remember during one of the meetings he said, well, this is kind of a legacy thing for me. He said, I want to see these companies succeed, but it's not about the money. He was like, I've made my money. Like he doesn't care about the money. He said, I want to see this company, around when I want my grandkids to own this. I want them to carry this. And so a legacy project all of a sudden gave me the idea. I said, okay, well now I have something to hang my hat on. Now I have something to really kind of, I can kind of push the envelope a little bit. And so really it became, all right, if this is going to be his legacy, then let's make sure that it is something that's lasting, and let's try to do something in a way that really nobody's really done it before. Not quite this way. And so I said, well, we're going to try to recreate a lost style of rye, and we're going to try to take it a few extra steps farther than anybody else has. We're going to try to do it as closely as we possibly can. And as soon as that decision was made, all of a sudden we were like, oh, I guess we're gonna order a three-chamber still now. I guess we're gonna order more fermenters. I guess we're gonna. And it was, I mean, it was crazy, but that's what ended up happening. And so, you mentioned Laura Fields and Bob McDonald. They're friends of mine now, and um, we were interacting with them, and we were pulling information from them, um, and and we really wanted to insert ourselves into the whiskey conversation because and I don't want to come off as like, the jaded distiller or anything like because I'm really not. Well, I mean my guys think I am, but um the I'm just being fair.
That's fine.
But you know, um we're at this funny tipping point in the industry where uh I think there's been just a lot of self-sabotage by a lot of distillers just shooting themselves in the foot, big guys especially. But it's like how many more, cast finished allotted bottlings do people really chase down anymore? I mean, there is some of that. There's always going to be a market for that, right? But when we see reports about the whole whiskey industry taking like a 1% dip year on year, and then you realize that the bulk of that 1% is actually from Jack Daniels, like, something's not right. Now, it turns out if you really look at the granularity of the numbers, if you really look at it, the market segment that we're in is really very healthy. In fact, it's exhibiting a lot of growth. But there's this sort of like the segment that Jack is in, and then there's sort of like the upper luxury segments where they kind of don't know where they want to be. And then you have a lot of non-distiller producers. I have no problem with non-distiller producers, by the way. Like, it's fine. If you have a brand and you're honest about what you're doing and all that stuff, I think it's great. I just don't know at this point if that's really what a lot of consumers are after. Like everybody's kind of heard the story of like, oh, well, we wanted to resurrect this brand that my great great grandfather or somebody, and it's like, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, who knows? But it just it's a lot of it these days, just too many brands. And I don't want to overgeneralize because there's obviously a lot of good work being done out there by a number of different brands, but both NDPs and actual distillers alike. But there's a lot of inauthentic stuff out there, you know, and it just drives me up the wall when I see it. And not only that, but I think that is something that people really crave now. I mean, we hear this in, talks on marketing all the time, and people want authenticity, blah blah blah, and it's true, right? I I always kind of tell people, like the guys that work for me and the marketing people, I made a big spiel about this recently. I was like, look, um, when we tell people our story, I don't like using the word story because a story implies that there's something fictional about it. That's not what we're doing. And to be honest, nobody really likes to be sold to at this point. You're inundated with stuff on your social media feeds and through internet and television and all this stuff every day where somebody's trying to get your hard-earned money for something, right? The algorithms have just gotten a lot better at figuring out where you are and the stuff you might spend money on, which drives people even crazier. Nobody really likes being sold to. And I think the best salesperson is somebody that's just going to tell you about something that they really enjoy and they're honest about it. And so we sort of started to build this whole ethos about what we wanted to be and what it really meant. Um, and and the history of rye whiskey really came into that. Um, you know, Pennsylvania, particularly Western PA, was really the place where whiskey became big in the United States first. Obviously Kentucky has taken that mantle long ago and has just blown it to worldwide proportions. But this part of the state was really what made American whiskey something important and something real and something tangible that not just the people in this country could be proud of, but that people abroad would get excited about. And it was really rye whiskey. And a lot of my friends, local distillers, they kind of focus on the Whiskey Rebellion, which is great. Those 3 years are really, and those events, wildly important to our history. We're still feeling the reverberations of what happened in 1794 to this day. But it was really just 3 years of history. And when I come in to work on any in a new area, whether it's for a client or whether it's for one of my own projects or whatever, one of the first things I do is I think about, all right, who's doing what locally? Because I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I don't want to be that jerk that comes in like, well, you're doing, Whiskey Rebellion stuff. I'm going to do that too. That seems like a good fit for me. I want to do something a little bit different, both for my sake and theirs.
I was gonna say that
Because I
doesn't.
think there's
Yeah, I'm sorry to jump in there, but that doesn't sound like your personality at all. To just come in and be like, I see these people are doing well on this, you know,
yeah,
the whiskey rebellion, so I'm just gonna piggyback on top of that. That from
yeah.
what from the last hour we've been talking, that doesn't sound at all like your personality.
There's a and there's a lot of people that do that, and
Sure,
that's I
yeah,
mean, and it's really frustrating to see it. Um, so no, we wanted to come in and we wanted to make sure that everybody knew that we were going to do our own thing, that we would be friends with everybody. That you know, if you're a distiller and you come in and you're respectful, I have an open door policy. You can come in. We actually view ourselves as a teaching distillery. So like some of our so-called competitors, and they probably don't want me saying who they are, but they come in and they hang out. They're allowed to bounce ideas, ask questions, use us as a soundboard for some of the things that they might be interested in trying. Maybe I can help them, maybe I can't. I don't know, but at least we try to be very open with everybody. Um, and and that really, I mean, for us with the whole history thing, the golden era of rye was the second half of the 19th century before Prohibition. That really was it. That was where you started to see all this money really coming into Pennsylvania. Now, bourbon was starting to get big at that point, but throughout most of the 19th century, rye really was the whiskey of choice for
Mhm.
most Americans. Um, and then, when Prohibition was about to happen, the Pennsylvania distillers historically didn't play well together. They were very cutthroat, blah, blah, blah. Well, like the rest of the distilling industry, they kind of didn't take Prohibition as seriously as they should have.
Mhm.
Uh, the one difference, though, was that Kentucky got smart. A lot of the distillers in Kentucky started consolidating. Um, they started buying each other out, and they started sort of amassing, concentrating their fortunes under just a few banners. That kind of helped the storm a little
Mhm.
bit. That helped them ride it out. Now, I mean, there was no perfect way to deal with it, unfortunately, but that really did help. Um, and then when Prohibition ends, you have these things. First there was an agricultural subsidy for corn. There wasn't one for rye. So bourbon producers had a little bit of a leg up there. But because they had the foresight to kind of handle their fortunes a little bit better than the Pennsylvania distillers did, Pennsylvania distillers came back weakened, almost decimated, and only a few of them really survived.
Mhm.
And in 1989, really, they had pretty much all shut down with the closing of the Baumberger distillery. And Dick Stoll basically, well, going into at the time he thought it was full retirement, but yeah, or at least from distilling. So now we're kind of coming back, and we really wanted to focus on that style of rye. Um, we know, for instance, that we know a few things, especially talking with Laura Fields and Sam Komlenik, basically our whiskey historians in PA. We know that in that era, the whiskey was all pot still or chamber still. We had no column stills here. Okay. So, column still whiskey is not a bad whiskey. It's just a different whiskey. So, column still rye in Pennsylvania um, can obviously be excellent, but not historically accurate, in my opinion. All right, that doesn't mean it's bad. Just um, We know, and there's some inferences and things like that we can make. We can assume that the fermentation times were probably a little bit longer than they are standard now, because that was fairly common back then. Right now, fermentation times for single malt in the UK are around 50 hours, on average, for a lot of them. And in Kentucky, maybe 72 hours, you know. So we figured that it would probably be at least 96 hours for rye, and we do a full 7 days for our single malt. Um, we so everything was sweet mash here. It was not sour mashed. There were maybe one or two examples of sour mashing, but it was definitely not normal in Pennsylvania to see a sour mash. Um, we don't sit on a lot of limestone in where the distilleries are, and so we're not using really hard water up here. If you're using hard water, sour mash really helps. All right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, just I'm sorry to just jump in again, but that does, to me, it immediately raises a question. Like, we think of, and perhaps this is an incorrect stereotype, but we think of sweet mashing as, to put it bluntly, a harder process. That it
Mhm.
takes longer. You've got to clean between each one. Similar to your brewing brethren who
Yeah.
would know about that. Um, Whereas sour mash, you can do the continuous. You can kind of just throw the back set in. Again,
Yeah.
gross oversimplification, but we think of it as harder, and thus it asks the question: well, if this is going to be a harder process, why would they do it once,
I don't,
especially after you get,
well, it's really not that much harder, honestly. It's really not.
yeah, like I said,
Um,
stereotype, but please break
yeah.
that up. Yeah.
The thing is that we have an abundance of water here. Particularly, most of these distilleries were located along the Monongahela or the Allegheny rivers, so they
Mhm.
had ample water. So there was no worry about, oh, well, sour mashing does save on water usage a little bit, not much, but a little bit. Um, you know, Sour mashing is a lot more consistent. That's for sure. But if you know how to do a sweet mash properly, sweet mashing can also be really consistent as well. But really, the big thing, it's not the only benefit. There's lots of benefits to sour mashing in Kentucky, but really one of the big benefits, and I don't think anybody realized it at the time, but one of the big benefits I would argue was that it corrected the pH of their mashes, which made them more efficient. The enzymes worked better. Uh, with heavy limestone water, the pH kind of goes up. It's calcium carbonate, and that tends to raise the pH. Now, the enzymes will work. They just tend to work really slowly. Um, so by sour mashing, they're able to kind of fight back against that higher pH a little bit. They can bring it down. The enzymes become a bit more efficient at doing what they're supposed to do, which is breaking down starch and sugar and all these other things. Um, Obviously, you'll get somebody on. If you tell somebody from Kentucky that I said that, they'll be like, "Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about." There's some truth to it, though, whether they want to admit to it or not. Um, but I mean, there's a lot of really interesting flavor development that happens with sour mashing as well. Um, but these are things that, yeah, we know that there just really wasn't that much sour mashing that happened here. They didn't need to do it. Sour mashing also requires a certain amount of infrastructure, like larger tanks and things like that, to kind of handle like different liquid streams. A lot of these distillers would have been smaller. They just would have been a lot more numerous. I don't know if many of them would have had the wherewithal to deal with, backset really all that much. So,
That's
so
fair.
there's also that as well. Um, some of that's speculation, but it kind of makes sense. So, so knowing that, we were going to do a sweet mash. We cooked the grains purposefully at slightly lower temperature. Once again, that's a bit of inference. Based on some of the old mashing techniques, I would find it hard to believe that they got their mashes that hot when they were cooking their grains. Um, but I mean, it's possible, certainly as the technology evolved. But I would think that, yeah, likely they probably cooked at a slightly cooler temperature. And even if that weren't the case, honestly, because we work with all heirloom grains, which would have been the norm back then. This was before commodity agriculture. This was at a time when you purchased the grain from your buddy down the street that had a farm, right?
Sure.
And he was probably holding that seed, some of that seed back to plant again the following year. And just every year, it was the same thing. That's an heirloom grain, right? There really wasn't such a thing as Monsanto selling you, corn kernels that you had by contract to buy from them again the next year. You're not allowed to hold back corn kernels for planting from Monsanto crops, which is insane, but that's a whole other thing. So, uh, so you are working with heirloom grains. There's a lot of evidence to support that Rosen rye is a white rye varietal, probably pretty close to the type of rye that they were using in at least in this part of Pennsylvania back then. It was a very uh, uh, popular style of rye. Rosen came out of Michigan originally, but yeah, I mean there's a lot of evidence to kind of support that. So, and certainly tasting some of the older whiskeys, they seem to have a very similar character. Now, we know that, yeah, it was all chamber stills or pot stills. So we have both. We have a 1,500-gallon pot still and we have a 200-gallon chamber still, which when I say 200 gallons, that's per chamber. And there's, technically three operating, the sizing of three chambers is a little deceptive. But, so they were using both types of stills. They made very different types of whiskey. And outside of that, the big things really occurred in the warehouse, and we're trying to replicate all of this as well. The warehouses were virtually all brick, which has no insulation to it whatsoever. I can assure you. But the warehouses were virtually all brick, and they were steam heated. So we decided that we would go through great expense to steam heat our warehouse to keep the temperature above 70 year round. Which I know a lot of people will say, well, but don't you want the whiskey to go in and out of the barrel? And I'm like, yeah, but that's not really how it works. The whiskey does go into the barrel, but it doesn't, you lose whiskey to evaporation as that liquid level goes down in the barrel and it gets hot again. It just fills up the empty space where the evaporation left. It doesn't necessarily push back into the wood all that well.
Then you got,
So
hydrostatic pressure, you get air pressure coming in and
yeah,
out. There's a lot of different factors in that.
exactly. So I mean, this is something that's one of those like distillery tour guide tidbits that just drive me up the wall. But so we knew they were using brick line steam heated warehouses. We knew that they were going into the barrel at a very low entry proof. 101 was the most common that we saw. And we know that probably the most difficult piece of the puzzle was we know that at least in the well, actually all the way up until the 70s, Shenley was using these. But we know that the barrel size was anywhere from 35 to 42 gallons. And that was actually the most difficult piece of the puzzle to do. Strangely enough, the chamber still was far easier. Trying to find a cooperage that would do that size for me was a pain, but I finally did find someone to do it. Yeah, so we have these little 38, 40-gallon barrels that we use for our chamber still distillate. Our pot still distillate goes into your standard 53s, and but we have a very small amount allotted to these barrels, and we're really excited with what they're doing. So yeah, I mean that's sort of that project in a nutshell. We're kind of excited about the prospect of being able to hopefully recreate this old style of whiskey that, unless you've been fortunate to taste bottles from pre-prohibition, you may never have had before. I have been fortunate to taste some of those bottles, and some that have been kept in really great condition, and Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to say I feel like we're in the ballpark where we want to be. So fingers crossed. I'll
No, it's
bet a
good.
lot of my career on this one, but
No, it's good. I have three samples that have just been sitting on my desk for about 2 months now from someone I know we know mutually, who has let's say a significant collection of pre-prohibition
sure,
whiskey
sure.
in general, in addition rye as well. And that's always one of the questions I ask too. Whenever the term either reintroduction or revitalization, anything like that comes up, it's like, well, have you had the whiskey that you're trying to recreate here?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
otherwise,
exactly.
like, I get it if you're trying to make something from, and this was someone, I think it was someone, I'm a little, sorry, listeners, if you're listening, I'm just coming off of an illness, so my brain is even foggier than usual. But there was someone I spoke to recently who was reviving a style from, the 1850s, mid to late 19th century. And it was just a style, and it was in the UK, and it was a style that just had gone out of order so long ago that they couldn't find anything.
Yeah, yeah.
There was no extant liquid. There was at best some descriptions of what whiskey might have been like. I want to say it was the folks up at the Cabrach in
Mm,
northeastern Scotland, but I could be wrong on that. But I'll double check. But it was so long ago. There's no extant liquid. There's nothing. There's some basic descriptions that
yeah.
sometimes they tell you something. A lot of times they tell you absolutely nothing. It's subjective tasting notes basically. So how do you recreate something when you have no idea what you're recreating? And that's, I think, where both of us get a little ornery on that. Like, are you really recreating it, or
Yeah.
yeah?
It's a thing is that you kind of, so having tasted some of the liquid, you kind of have an idea of where it might go and sort of where the goalposts are, right?
Mhm.
But then there's also the thing, is it something that you really want to recreate though? And I think that's something that maybe doesn't get asked enough because we put on the rose-colored glasses and we assume that that things were better back when, and they weren't necessarily.
Mhm.
Now, I could make the comment, I could make the argument that a lot of the whiskey styles as they've evolved, rye, bourbon, single malt, particularly throughout the 20th century, have evolved in at least in part, if not large part, due to accountants coming in and saying, you know what, we could do this better. And so let me, the three chamber is an interesting example of this. And
Mhm.
the owner of our company hates when I say this, but when we started running the three chamber, he came in and asked me how it was going, and I said, honestly, running one, nobody in their right mind would want to run one of these things. And he was like, "Why would you say that?" And I was like, "Well, it's expensive. They are utility hogs. They take way more energy than even Vendome realized. We're actually having to upsize our boiler capacity to
Wow.
be able to run this thing consistently. Um, they are so labor intensive to run, and they're wildly inefficient. We don't get nearly as much liquid out of it per unit time as we do our pot still. Um, that being said, and I could tell he was kind of waiting for the but, and I was like, well, yeah, it's a huge but. Um, but I said, I don't think there's any other way to make this style of whiskey. Um, these stills operate under a much higher pressure, which increases the boiling point, which means we're extracting different essential oils out of the grain that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get. I mean, we're getting aromas and flavor, and things that, and I love our pot still distillate. It's just a very different beast. And so when people come up and they do tours with us, we actually will let them taste, the exact same recipe off the pot still versus the three chamber, and they're two completely different whiskeys. So you would never confuse the two. Um, and some people really love this three chambers. Some people really love the pot still. They're just very different. Um, I another thing that sometimes I talk about is how corn varietals have changed. I mean, have you ever actually tried yellow dent number two corn on its own?
It's not it's not really a food corn.
It's
It's a field
not.
corn.
It's
Yeah.
a field, yeah. All right. And that's the thing. Yellow dent number two has been around for a long time, since before Prohibition. Now, it's been genetically modified and all this stuff, in the past 50 years, but it's been around. It was an heirloom variety before that. And I can't honestly say, I mean, because I didn't have it back then, but it didn't sound like it was that much better. And I've come across like old articles from distillers back then. And I remember reading one talking about, and this was from like the early 1900s, like 1910 or something like that. And the guy was talking about how nobody in their right mind would dare make fine bourbon out of yellow dent corn. Nobody would do that. The only corn fit would be it would be a fine, white corn like Hickory King or something like that. It had to be like a high-end heirloom corn. Um, and basically the yellow dent corn made bourbon that wasn't fit for, anybody. And now Prohibition happens, right?
Mhm.
Bourbon industry collapses or nearly collapses. Uh, then at the tail end of Prohibition, you have the Great Depression. Farmers are foreclosing on their land. Just everything is just horrible for everybody. So Depression happens, and they finally get rid of Prohibition in 1933. And all of a sudden, there's an agricultural subsidy that comes in for corn. Well, now that was a really big boost for farmers. If you're a farmer and you're teetering on the brink of financial collapse and losing everything, are you going to take a risk growing some kind of heirloom corn that's a real pain in the butt and maybe doesn't give you that great of a yield? Or are you going to grow something that's more of a surefire thing that gives you a lot of corn per acre?
Right.
You're going to go with yellow dent, right?
Right.
So, well, yellow dent prices were able to come down, blah, blah, and they kind of worked through all these things. Well, all of a sudden you had marketing departments from bourbon companies coming out saying, we only use the finest yellow dent number two corn, and you still see this today.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's fun. And I'm not saying that the bourbon made with yellow dent is bad. I'm not saying that. I've made bourbon with yellow dent. I mean, and I've been very happy with it. I mean, there's a lot of really wonderful bourbon out there made with it. But the whole idea that we're using the finest ingredients that money can buy, it feels a little disingenuous. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, so I don't really buy. And there's loads of other examples, how the entry proof, the legal maximum entry proof for barrels in the United States up to 1964 was 110 proof,
Mhm.
and now it's 125. And you're gonna tell me that 125 proof, they did that because it made better whiskey, or it just let them fit more alcohol into the barrels and save them money on cooperage?
Exactly. And that's
Largely a
and that
finance, if you ask
right.
me.
But that in
Yeah.
response is in itself in response to needing new American oak barrels each time, which
Yeah.
increase the profits and drive for cooperages.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's going back and forth with each other.
Exactly, exactly. And so and we definitely, and I could really, really lay into the Scotch whiskey industry on this because a lot of decisions, particularly by DCL, now Diageo, um, have been made. And I have friends that work for Diageo, and I love a lot of their whiskeys, so I'm not trying to pick on them. But a lot of the decisions that have been made have been less in service to making a better whiskey, I would wager, and more to, pad the bank a little bit. So, um, but then again, I'm just a cynic.
I mean, I agree with everything you said about it. And honestly, you don't close places like Port Ellen and Brora, not to mention the numerous others that I could name just in Scotland alone. If you're if you're focused more on flavor and quality
Yeah.
over profit, like those places made amazing whiskeys, and hopefully the new Port Ellen will make something akin to what the old Port Ellen did. But
Oh, I have no doubt that
mm,
they will.
you know,
I think what's interesting about that, and not that I disagree with you, but I think that we also tend to look at these decisions through like a very modern lens,
mm,
as whiskey connoisseurs, aficionados, we're geeks about this stuff, and we're like, how could you possibly ever consider closing Port Ellen? How could you possibly consider closing Bora? Um, I I mean, well, and Diageo is just hilarious to me. One of their I won't say which, but we were talking with one of the managers of one of their properties, and they were closing it down. And I asked them, "Why are you guys closing? I thought this place was doing quite well." And they said, "Well, we opened up another property that some distance away that could make the same product." And so the accountants started noticing that that property, it was really expensive to make this product because they weren't making as much. So they started shifting our production over to that property to bring, the overall price down. Well, then they started to notice that it was really expensive for us to make stuff, and they thought, it's time to get rid of them. I kid you, you can't make this stuff up.
no,
But, this was the explanation they gave me. And I know I know that some of it just doesn't make any sense, because we were there bidding on equipment that they were auctioning off,
okay,
and we purchased a seven-figure barrel filling and disgorging system that they'd only had for maybe 8 years. We purchased it for $1,500.
oh my
Um,
god,
you know, I was like, I have no use for this, but this is insane if we let it go. So, eh, but anyway, getting back to what I was saying, we think of these things, we think it would be insane that they would shut these places down. But I think the concept of connoisseurship in whiskey is, at least as we see it now, is somewhat modern. And so, not that people didn't have their brands, not that people didn't think of, Port Ellen or Broad or, whoever else as these fine whiskeys necessarily, but they certainly weren't elevated, I'd wager, to this near mythical status. And some of that's
yeah,
from hindsight on our end. Um,
yeah.
but
And a lot of these are places too that are they were victims of being closed before or during the early stages of the single
yeah,
malt boom. So you never tasted Port Ellen by itself or by itself. It was always in
yeah,
a Johnny Walker, what was it, oldest at first, and then
yeah,
came blue in the early 90s, or the green, or any of these blends that came out. So when someone at that point would have said, "Oh, you're closing Port Ellen," it'd be like, "Where?
yeah,
What's that?"
exactly.
You know, I always think of Kalila as this is a giant distillery that's pumping out most of Diageo's
They're
peated
massive.
malt. They're
Yeah,
putting out most of their Isla peated malt, and yet you only really know about them because of independent bottlers, and because independent
yeah,
bottlers have recognized that it's a damn fine single malt.
yeah.
Um, Honestly, especially unpeated, is the unpeated one
Hmm.
is really exceptional. But for me, if you put a peated Kalila in like a really strong sherry cask, pork barbecue just dripping
Yeah.
with fat, perfect. But I hear what you're saying, that a lot of it is it's accountant based. It's not actually about taste. And as you said, if you're looking at it through a modern lens, we're looking at it as people who have these single malts, who have these independent bottlers, who would have tried the components. We've tried the
Yeah.
components of these blends now, but even 30 years ago, we didn't necessarily have that option.
No, no, we
You would
didn't.
have had to be in the distillery trying things off the still to know what that particular facility tasted like.
Yeah.
Don't have
No,
that.
and and we see it with bourbon too. And I mean, prior to the late 80s, early 90s, with the advent of, Saz or Buffalo Trace releasing, single barrel bourbon through Blanton's, and then, the small batch collection from Jim Beam. Bourbon was bourbon, you had your favorite brand. That's what you stuck with. And yeah, but you didn't really think of it. It just wasn't an elevated thing.
Sure.
Um, and I mean, and, it's a really wonderful thing that I think we have now, that there's this crazy interest in it, and um, people people absolutely, fawn over the latest release of this and that. And um, but at the same time, some of these companies, I do think like Jim Beam or Jack Daniels in particular, I actually love single barrel Jack Daniels. I love some of their single barrel releases. The Bonded uh, was really just out of this world for me. I got to try the Bonded Rye before it was released. I mean, yeah, there was just all this really cool stuff about it. But at the same time, you kind of do wonder if they lost the plot a little bit sometimes. And um, I don't know, but
Uh,
that's a whole other discussion.
like I hear you on that too. I used to have Elijah Craig Barrel Proof as my kind of daily drinker if I wanted something high proof. That switched over to the Jack Daniels because even if they were single barrels, they tended to be more consistent for me in being
Yeah,
consistently good.
yeah,
This is post like Pirate Bottle ECBPs and the early like I don't know B518 and B20 were favorite batches of mine. But after that, it was just so inconsistent that
yeah.
I knew that if I grabbed a Jack Daniel's single barrel proof, that I was gonna probably like it. And it's $65, same price as the UCBP. It's not skin off my back to go from one to the
Right,
other. I'm not losing
right.
anything. Then you come out with a single barrel rye at barrel proof, which I was fortunate enough to grab, depending on how you look at it, either 2 or 3 barrels of when we did a single barrel selection there.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, it's fantastic. I love it. When they did their Tennessee Taster series that tried out that um, barrel proof rye in 2019, oh my God, it was something brand new. So on one hand, yes, I agree with you. I love it. And in many ways, even for a behemoth like them, they're still driving some innovation and they're
Oh,
driving just
absolutely.
and they're just driving the fact of American whiskey as an export. So that's helping, economically. But I agree with you too about losing the point of like, someone like Jack Daniel would probably not have made much rye,
Yeah.
and like you said, this is a whole different podcast, and I've mentioned on other ones, but like he wouldn't have made so much rye. He would have definitely done the corn route, maybe even made some barley, based on where he was,
Sure.
where that county is. So, like, is the rye traditional? Does it fit within the quote unquote story, the truth of the distillery? So there's a lot to go there too, and I
And
do want to
it's yeah,
rant about
it's
that.
hard to
Yeah,
buy into it's hard to buy
yeah,
into the rye thing, from
yeah.
and not that I dislike I love their rye and I tasted a really nice bottle of single barrel cast strength rye from them actually just a few months ago and I just loved it. But would it have been something that Jack Daniel himself? No, I don't think so in the
Right,
least.
right.
And that is something that I think, when you kind of and you mentioned that they are driving some innovation. I think they are to a point. I think all the large distilleries are to a certain extent, but a lot of them, in my opinion, are kind of passing off iteration as innovation at this point. And and it's like, every week I see it through my feed like, oh, we're releasing this uh single malt that's been finished in this French Chateau's wine cask. Nobody's ever done this before. And I'm like, well, actually, yeah, it's just that your
Yeah,
competitor did it last week with a different Chateau's wine cask. Like,
right.
that's not innovation to me at all. And then you
Totally
get into this conversation of like what's innovation versus gimmick and all that stuff. But I think we're really just scratching the surface on what whiskey can be and what it can mean
agree.
to people. And innovation is scary and expensive for companies. And so I think a lot of these guys do play it a little on the safe side. Um, and and then, not to bring it back to Iron City, but I mean that is something
No, I
that
mean,
we
we
take
we should. You're
very
on here for a reason too. So
well. No, I mean, but
I don't
that's
want to
what
lose. Yeah,
we take this whole idea very seriously, and um, because I give talks on innovation strategies and recipe design and things like that, and I'll point out areas of the whiskey world that maybe we haven't really done that much work on, and people are like, well, why don't you do those things? And I'm like, because it doesn't fit with my brand, you know. Our brand is all about moving forward by looking backwards a little
Mhm.
bit. That's really what we're doing. We're looking to the past and hopefully we're going to push the category forward a little. That's to me, like that's the biggest success I could possibly have. If I have somehow at the end of my career meaningfully, no matter how small, but just meaningfully added, contributed to the category moving forward, then that's a win for me. And I think that would be a win for our owner and our company if we're in part of the conversation. But do I need to be messing with like I was at Corsair, alternative grains? I mean, they're fun, they're great, and they make fantastic whiskey, right? I loved making quinoa whiskey when I was at Corsair. It was one of my favorite things to do, but it has nothing to do with my brand. And that's the thing. At the end of the day, I'm trying to build a company. The brand is king. Everything has to be kind of done in service to that, or else it just doesn't fit. And
Sure.
the story doesn't make sense. And I don't want to lose the plot thread at all, which I do think some of these companies like Jack Daniels have maybe kind of done. Um, and they'll get themselves back on track. Jack Daniels taking a sales dip over the past year is very much a temporary thing. I don't think
Yeah.
Jack Daniels is disappearing anytime soon. But
No. And we're
yeah,
talking in the wake of was it just this morning or last night? The report came out that Brown Forman was
yeah,
cutting some. They were cutting quite a few jobs actually, and some
quite a few.
production.
Yeah,
So it's which is of course unfortunate anytime jobs are lost, and we're seeing a market correction across many different sectors. As you said, the sector that you're in right now is actually showing pretty good growth. Uh, I'm going to leave that mostly for part two of our
yeah.
conversation because there's so much to explore there in and of itself. But I want to just tease a little bit of that part two as well. There's something you just mentioned that I really want to delve a little deeper into, which is also came from a conversation with Reed, which was he was asking about innovation, and he was
Hmm.
asking about like he had spoken to a professor recently who had said that distillation is a mature science, and
Yeah,
the meaning there was that mature science means that we know most of what it is at this point. We know most about it. It's not quite a dead science, but it's there's not a lot of innovation to do. So now both you and Reed disagreed with this point, um, saying that the stills maybe there's not a
yeah,
ton of innovation left on the stills. Like they there were so many patents in the 1800s. By the 1950s, they just dry up, um, and most of the new things are just iterations of older ideas. But on the other hand, you've got things like engineering, liquid management, these little tweaks that maybe aren't these massive like pot still to column still or coffee still to this or switching over
yeah,
to a continuous still. Fine, they're not these massive, truly industry changing things in that sense. Maybe those have been kind of done out, if you will, but that doesn't mean that there aren't so many nuances to still be found. And I I say that one is a true believer in that, but also because in thinking about some of the grains that you're working with, you mentioned some of the alternative ones you had at Corsair. You're not working
hmm.
with quinoa anymore, but or as far as I know, like triticale or that. But
Actually, I have been
oh,
working with Critical a little bit. Yeah,
okay, so actually,
yeah.
I'm sorry, you're right. I did see that on the map, but so I looked at the map on your site, which I love. By the way, it's I love anything that's a little what's the word when you're
We're
interactive,
transparent. Yeah,
transparent. Yeah,
we're transparent.
yeah. So like you can see the grains. You can see point by point, farm by farm. You've got Rosen, VNS, and Danko rye, soft red winter wheat, corn varietals such as Bloody Butcher, Hickory King, which you mentioned earlier, Wapsie
Hmm.
Valley. These are, there are a lot of heritages there. There's a lot of profiles to master and to just get a sense of what they taste like on their own, let alone what they taste like in combination with each other in different mash bills. So the I guess the way I want to end this half, if you will, is to think about and start people thinking about this for our next one. This idea of where can you innovate? Where can you and where can as a teacher too, where can you see people who were you 15 years ago? So, learning
Yeah,
about fermentation science, barrels, cooperages, production of distillation, how to clean a brewery accurately
Yeah.
and sufficiently. Where can you educate them enough so that they have the basis and they have a wide enough basis that then they can pick out those little tweaks that are like maybe one example you gave in the interview was, what about baijiu production?
Yeah.
It's this massive industry. I think it's the most produced alcohol in the world.
Oh, yeah, by far.
It in China, it's native to China. There's different versions of it in other countries, fine, but baijiu, Chinese, like there's stuff to learn there. There's stuff to learn from shochu in Japan, from shaiju in South Korea, or soju rather in South Korea. There's tequila, gin. You said you'd worked in all these different categories as well, just at least in R&D. So thinking
So
about
yeah, well, I think what you're getting at. I mean, it's something that I really believe. And so that's Reed and I've known each other for years, and that is one point we kind of, I mean, we politely disagree on, but I don't think distillation's a dead science at all. I think that we've convinced ourselves it is. But no, it's definitely not a dead science. It's just that distillation, making a distilled spirit is time consuming
Mhm.
and it's expensive. All right. So it takes a really long time to make a good whiskey. All right. So, here in the United States, let's just say 4 years or whatever. Well, if it takes you that long and you have capital expenditures tied up in liquid for 4+ years, you're going to be a little trigger shy on trying something new. So
Mhm.
traditions have kind of evolved to a point where this is just the way we do them. We don't ask questions. We don't want to know how the sausage is really made. Um, we just know it works, and that's what we're sticking with. That's the industry in a nutshell. We are traditional, and that's great. It makes a lot of great products, but we are, in my opinion, where you run into trouble is where traditionalism becomes orthodoxy. Um, and I don't think that any technique is sacred. Um, and so when I teach my classes or write books or articles or work with clients, whatever, even with my own employees, I'm like, look, you have a right to question everything. You really do. This is why I like studying different spirit categories because it it kind of opens my mind up to new problem solving solutions, new approaches, to recipe development, product development, flavor, everything.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I mean, the long and short of it is no, we're nowhere close to, I think, really with any spirit category. And whiskey has evolved a bit more than some of the other ones. I mean, cognac is, oh my God, you want to talk about tradition. Um,
Yeah,
so
throw Armagnac in there too for
yeah, I mean,
same
it's,
thing. Yeah.
and I love those brandies. I absolutely do. But they are very stuck in certain techniques. I mean, even the timing of when they are legally allowed to do something,
Mhm.
they have rules about that. And so it's yeah, I think for most spirit categories we barely scratch the surface of what is possible. And I think yeah, we have once again we have the historical context of looking at things like the charred oak barrel, the coffee still, these things being to us earth-shattering innovations. And I don't know, I wasn't around in 1830 when Aeneas Coffey patented his still. I kind of get the impression from what I read everybody's like, it's like an overnight success. I'm like, yeah, it's like a 50-year overnight success. Like, I mean, it took a while for that to catch on. So to say that that was like this earth-shattering thing, in hindsight, yes. At the time, I really don't think it was. You know, I think he was quirky and considered a bit of an anomaly. Um, you
He
know,
was almost beaten to death before he even created the still, just for
yeah.
apparently for being him. So
Well, there you go. So, um, Yeah, I've never gotten that far, thankfully. But anyway,
Yeah,
so that's where I'll leave that. So
fair. And this is going to sound like a like just kind of an inserted shout out, but it's really relevant to a lot of the topics that we discussed tonight, and we'll discuss in the next one, which is have you spoken or do you know Drew Hanish over at Whiskey Lore?
that name sounds familiar. Maybe. I feel
He'll
bad
probably
if I
be.
do know.
No, it's fine. He's a very humble guy. He wouldn't take any offense. He just came out with a new book. He likes to go into the history like we do and really analyze that history, see
Mhm.
what can we decide as fact, fiction, kind of in the middle. And the reason I bring this up, and I'm getting no royalties or anything from this, is simply that he just wrote a book on whiskey myths and legends,
Yeah.
and one of them was about Aeneas Coffee and how it's this overnight success and how he
Yeah.
his whole story that's been mythologized. And like there are parts that are true, but like
Sure.
you
Oh
said, it
yeah.
wasn't overnight. It was 50 years. It was a long
Yeah.
time. And like I said, he had that story of like he's almost beaten to death before he even created that still. So there's a good chance that he wouldn't have done so. These ideas about corn varieties and barrel sizes and the things we take for granted when we go on a tour of a distillery. I remember you specifically said this earlier. It was a throwaway line, but I remembered it uh, because of that, which was something that you hear out of a tour guide's mouth at a distillery, and you're like, okay, we're going to take that as fact because it's. I mean, he's saying, but
Oh,
you're
I
like,
got a long list of them, buddy.
yeah, you're
Yeah.
like that's not accurate.
Yeah.
That's just not the case. So the reason, so I bring it up just because it's a great resource. It's not overly expensive. Whiskey Lore is usually one of my biggest resources when I'm doing research for episodes. If he's done one with somebody, I'm going to listen to it because he does the work. So anyway, shameless plug on that. But the point being that there are a lot of these myths and legends that have some element of truth to them, maybe. But
Yeah.
if we're really looking at it as, these are the types of rye they would have been using where you are on the banks of the Allegheny, just a couple miles up from where the Allegheny and the Ohio meet to form the Monongahela. Uh, the different barrel sizes, the idea that we would have always used the 53 gallon, like that's a relatively recent
It is.
standardization.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, these are all things that need to be interrogated and need to be thought about. And uh, if we want to find the innovation, maybe we can find the innovation in one of those pieces of fiction as well.
Yeah.
Kind of think of it as
Absolutely.
like a Jules Verne kind of thing where he's thinking of these things that didn't exist in his time and yet or
We
well,
see
same
them
thing.
today.
H.G.
Yeah.
Wells, yeah. uh, Here we are with submarines and with Da Vinci and helicopters and these things that
Mhm.
were hundreds of years ahead, but someone eventually created them.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
fiction that becomes fact, and I think that can be something really interesting to think about. But anyway, I've kept you very long this
That's all
evening.
right. That's all right.
Um, I will have you back in short order to talk more about the other side of your work, which is not only consulting, but which we'll kind of put to the side a little bit, but the education piece, especially your work with
Sure.
Moonshine
Yeah.
University, with IBD, with your work in the UK as well, around the world, as we talk about. We'll talk about
Yeah.
truly around the world. And I'm also going to tease you by saying that I will be starting the conversation, however it goes, by starting with the term master distiller, because I know how much you hate that term.
Oh, yeah,
And
I know. That's my official title too. Oh
I
man, that's
know
so
it is.
ridiculous.
And you'll notice I did not introduce you that way because I know how much you hate it.
Yeah. Oh
Um,
man, I hate that term.
so
Yeah.
there's the side of respect of not calling you that, but also
I
I'm going to trigger
appreciate
you as
that.
soon as we start off.
Yeah.
Um, but with that, Matt, thank you so much for coming on for the first part of this interview, which really enjoyable. Great to talk to you. I will be checking with you offline about that Argentinian single malt because now I got to
Okay.
know.
Yep.
I so in thinking too, so confirming, I've had whiskey from 5 continents and talked to people from 5 continents. I've had spirits from 6, so
Nice.
that's the split there.
There you
So
go.
we will have you back on in the show notes for this episode. As always, there will be links to Iron City Distilling, the current line that's out right now, because you've got the whiskey coming off of the pot stills and the chamber still is not quite ready for
No,
market yet.
we got some time on that. Yeah.
Yeah, got some time, but the Distiller's Reserve line, as Matt said earlier, is from his time at District Distilling. It's distilled by
Yep.
him. They were able to purchase it and are selling it through Iron City under the Distillers Reserve line. So you can, I loved how you put on the website that it's not distilled at Iron City, but it's still your resume. And I really like
That's
that
how,
idea.
yeah, that was how they viewed it. And I said, oh, yeah, sure. That's there you go.
I mean, I love that idea. Like, this is what the guy made before. If you like
Yeah,
this, you're probably going to like what comes out in 2, 3 years from now. So
that is the
um,
hope. Yeah.
that's the hope. So with that, uh, thank you everyone for listening. Listen to the end notes as always to hear where you can see and follow Iron City, where you can see Matt. There will be links in this episode and the next one where he's on. Matt, hold on with me for just a sec after we finish recording. This has been another episode of the Whiskering Podcast. Thank you all for listening and for supporting the show. And I will see you all next time.